This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with the iconic Jeffrey Deitch to discuss an exciting 2022 exhibition at Deitch's Los Angeles Gallery that's been synthesized into a new book titled Luncheons on the Grass, available now from Rizzoli Electa. The innovative exhibition revisited and reimagined Édouard Manet's seminal work, Le Déjeuner célèbre, a painting that shocked the 1863 Parisian art scene and is often heralded as the first modern painting. Our conversation today explores how Deitch convinced over 30 of today's most acclaimed painters, including Cecily Brown, Jeff Koons, and Christina Quarles, to respond to Manet's painting by creating works that dialogue with this historic piece, each bringing contemporary perspectives to themes of modernism, realism, and societal depiction. The result not only reconsiders Manet's impact on modern art, but also examines the intersections of historical reverence and contemporary creativity. Jeffrey and I are also joined for the conversation by Viola Angiolini, Director of Research and Curatorial Projects at Jeffrey Deitch Gallery. And now, a conversation about being in dialogue with the birth of modernism with Jeffrey Deitch. Jeffrey Deitch, thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. You've been at the center of the contemporary art world for nearly 50 years. As an artist, writer, curator, dealer, advisor, I don't think there's a greater polyhyphenate out there than you, Jeffrey. But we're also joined today by Viola Angiolini, Director of Research and Curatorial Projects at Jeffrey Deitch Gallery. And our topic today is a new book published by Rizzoli Electa titled Luncheons on the Grass, Reimagining Manet's Le Déjeuner célèbre. You know, before the book, there was an exhibit, and before that, there was an inspiration. Jeffrey, what were the seeds of this project?
I think it starts in my art history classes 50 plus years ago at Wesleyan University, where the first slide in the classic lecture on modern art is Manet's Le Déjeuner célèbre. And there was a big statement, this is the first modern painting. Of course, it's much more complicated than that. Modern art doesn't start with one painting. But if you want to have to point to one iconic image that says so much about the birth of modernism, that's it, that's the painting. But of course, it is and remains a very controversial painting, particularly today. It has aspects that can be interpreted as sexist. It maybe is politically incorrect, but it's an artwork that still is so inspiring. And when we develop this concept of asking some of the leading figurative artists today to channel this painting into their current work and react to it with their own paintings or sculpture, almost every artist we asked said yes. And the results are incredible. We'll see in the book, but in the exhibition, artists came up with some astonishing works that, say, some of them rival the impact of the Manet painting itself.
So what do you think it is about this specific painting that continues to capture our imagination 160 years later? I mean, why did all of these contemporary artists so easily find a connection to the piece? Why is it that they are so excited to respond to it?
Well, there are some fundamental concepts of how art works over the centuries. Artists today are in conversation with artists of the past and very much in conversation still with artists of the 19th century, artists of the development of modernism. Just like Manet was in dialogue with Titian, Giorgione, Raphael. So there's something essential about painting here, that artists are looking to the past as well as to the present and looking toward the future. So this painting is a very good example of that. And many of the best artists still do that. We've all gone to museums with artist friends, and it's remarkable how engaged most of the artists are with art history, know a lot about it, and maybe people who aren't inside the field don't realize this so much, but that most of the best artists are great students of art history and incorporate conversation with artists of an earlier generation into their own work. And the Déjeuner sur l'herbe is one of the ultimate conversation points. Now, also, the painting is very much about painting. So there are many other things it's about. It's about the new modern Paris and new bourgeoisie and life of leisure and social classes. So a lot of complex material in this work, but it's also very much about painting, and something that I write about in my introduction is, first, it appeared this is a landscape painting. This is a plein air painting done outside in the borders of the Seine. And then you look at it carefully, and it appeared this landscape is like a backdrop. This is like we're looking at a theater set. So there's such an interesting interplay between engagement with nature, artificiality, theatricality. What is painting? Is it just a kind of photographic like interpretation of something you see in nature, or is it all constructed and invented? So all these issues are there in this painting.
I totally agree. The best art is in dialogue with art from the past. And that art, it's not just a dialogue with those previous artists, but it's also a dialogue with the viewer, right? I mean, you're leaving something there where if the viewer can recognize a reference, an Easter egg, then the viewer gets a tiny jolt of pleasure and feels like they're privy to a secret or some sort of, inside knowledge.
Yes, this is such a complex painting that you don't get it in the first 30-second view. So I've visited this painting over many, many years, since the 1970s when I go to Paris. And every time I see it, more is revealed. Like there are little elements. Sometimes, at first you might miss the bird, and lots of symbolism. Cecily Brown pointed out how fascinating this sort of still life of the discarded clothing is in the front. So there are so many fascinating elements. And I love that Duchamp taught us that it's the viewer who completes the work of art. And this is a painting that's sort of very much before the conceptual era, but this very much is a painting that has to be completed by the viewer.
So let me ask you, I think many of us know the story about how the painting was included in the Salon de Refusé, but there's an essay in the book by Thomas Crow which provides a little bit more visual understanding of what that looked like. And I guess I didn't understand how Manet had actually framed the work between two other Manet pieces. Can you talk a little bit about that? Was he providing additional context by how he framed those pieces on the wall at that salon?
So I think we should back up and tell us what was the Salon de Refusé. Okay, so the salon was essential for artists to get recognition in mid-19th century France. Also, it was an official government project. So the emperor, Napoleon III, who was conscious of the sentiment of the public, realized that there was some frustration that so many people, so many artists were restricted from the salon. So it was actually the emperor who decided that there should be a salon de refusés. From our current perspective, one would think, oh, it's the artists who did it themselves. But actually, that wasn't the case. So Manet, even though he might have been arguably the most radical artist of his time, he craved official recognition. Manet never participated in the Impressionist exhibitions. He wanted to be in the salon. He aspired to getting a Legion of Honor. And so this was very important to him. And also the salons, also the Salon de Refusés was very crowded. And the artists could not control the placement unless they had some sort of political ally who had a lot of power. And a lot of the artists, their work was hardly noticeable because it was hung high up by the ceiling. So I would expect that what Manet was trying to do was just to give the work some more prominence so it wouldn't be lost. Thomas Crowe's essay gives many insights about this, that so it's not very well known that, yes, there were 3 paintings there. Maybe, Viola, you might want to add some insights.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really fascinating how Crowe really starts off by describing what the installation might have looked like. And he does so by looking at the cartoon designed by Fabricius around the time, which really is like one of the very few documents, if you can call it so, portraying what the installation at the Salon de Refusés looked like. And another interesting fact that really connects to what Jeffrey was saying is how Crowe points out that while the Salon de Refusés had this like sort of counterpart role with the main salon, it was in fact in the same building. So that was something very, very interesting to notice, and also in relationship to what Jeffrey was saying about Manet's crave for recognition and be part of this institutional process in a way. I think that Crowe's essay is also brilliantly elaborated in the way he talks about Manet's like influence with in regards to his like Spanish interest and his love for Velázquez and the other reference and lessons that he learned by even just visiting the Louvre. So these paintings that were hanging next to actually on the sides of Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which both today are in the collection of the Met, are really replete with these references to the Spanish influence of Velázquez.
Yes, Manet was so inspired by Spanish painting. And that was sort of a part of the path to this modernist reinvention of painting. Went through Velázquez.
One of the artists that their response is really interesting was a Chinese artist, Liu Xiaodong. Now, I'm familiar with his work from a series he did a few years ago called Borders, and it's really ironic, I think, that here's a Chinese artist who does plein air portrait figurative painting, 8 feet by 10 feet, and we're asking him to respond to what we've always thought of as being a plein air painting, but now we actually kind of think that was done in the studio, and that landscape is more of a backdrop. And Jeffrey, maybe you or Viola can talk a little bit about the really interesting interpretation that Xiaodong took to this challenge.
Well, he makes it very personal. So that's his circle of friends, his circle of old artist friends. And there's some connections, the way Manet used family members and longtime model. The figures in the painting are very personal, very meaningful. And so just as Manet and his circle, they were revolutionaries within 19th century French artistic circles, who was also a revolutionary in being one of the first internationally oriented Chinese painters. It's interesting to note that Chinese figurative painting today comes through a route of Russian social realism. So the teachers who taught Western painting, so-called Western painting, in the Chinese Academy came from Russia. So you see some connection in his style to Soviet social realism. And so that's all the different elements that come into this is looking at Manet, his awareness of the American audience, this Soviet academic heritage all comes together there. And also, this is a tight group. It was, these were courageous people who sought a new artistic path, artistic freedom, when this was still Maoist China.
The roster of people that you were able to convince to participate, and it doesn't sound like the convincing was that difficult, but it's really a who's who list of contemporary figurative work. I mean, we're talking about the likes of Cecily Brown, Jeff Koons, Christina Quarles, Micheline Thomas, Salman Tour. I mean, there's a wide range of folks in the book. You know, there are essays that kind of set up the exhibit, and then these beautiful plates. And in the back, there's kind of one-on-one conversations with each of the artists. And you know, what's obvious in each of those conversations with the artists is that they all say the more time they spent with the painting, the more it spoke to them, and the more they appreciated the complexity of the work. And it kind of took them in different directions. Can you kind of talk about some of the pieces that surprised you as a result of this, or the ones that you have really been drawn to as a result of sparking this wildfire?
Well, let's start with my old friend Jeff Koons. So our conversations going back to the 1980s, Jeff was often talking about Manet. And one of his notorious works with Cicciolina is in fact entitled Manet. And so he was fascinated by Manet and particularly by this painting. And I was aware of the gazing ball painting that he did, referencing Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And I asked him about it, and I was not surprised at all to find out that he kept it for himself. It was the one work from this series he wanted to keep. And so there's so much in what Jeff does that has a foundation in Manet. And so I love the way the gazing ball brings the viewer into it. Our reflections there, the gazing ball reflects the painting, that we're inside that. So the most astonishing painting was actually 3 paintings by Cecily Brown.
Right.
So she conflated Déjeuner sur l'herbe with something that was very important in her artistic aesthetic formation. It's the album cover from Bow Wow Wow, and where is a kind of setup with figures in a pastiche of Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. So I love the way she overlaid contemporary popular culture onto it and came up with something just astonishing. And when you look carefully at the painting, I don't want to overinterpret, but one of the figures seems like a self-portrait of Cecily. And another portrait, I interpret as someone with resemblance to her father. So it's just fascinating. And sometimes when you put out an invitation for a thematic show like this, you connect with an artist just at the right moment when they're thinking about this. It's the right timing for them, and they come up with something totally astonishing, way beyond what you'd ever expect.
She describes in the book how this project has been pretty impactful on how she thinks she's going to work moving forward.
Well, the painting was much more figurative. There's always a figures inside Cecily Brown's work, but recently they've been more abstracted. I wouldn't say there's always a figure, but often is. But this was much more overtly figurative and inspired her to work more in this direction.
The exhibit also included works by artists that predate this challenge, right? Artists that are no longer with us. How did you go about curating those works?
Well, we put the Robert Colescott painting on the cover. And that painting is just incredibly great. And I became aware of this through a conversation with Jordan Schnitzer, whose foundation owns the work. And Jordan and I had, over the years, talked about Robert Colescott because Jordan's mother had a gallery in Portland, Oregon that represented Colescott. And the family retained a number of works, including this one. And I was just astonished to see it. And this has to be in the show. So, when you have a cover of a book on a group exhibition, it's very hard. You don't want to put one of the living artists on the cover where other artists will get upset. But I thought with Colescott, who's no longer with us, who's universally admired, okay, we can put Robert Colescott on the cover. And it is just an outstanding painting. And so Colescott, of course, adds all these complex layers of relationships between different races and past, present. His painting is really a masterpiece. And we're so fortunate that we were able to include that in the exhibition and really bring it to light, because prior to this, it's really not that well known.
It was funny that the longer I looked at these works, and I kept on going back to the original Manet, and at some point it struck me that Manet's painting really seemed to communicate a bit of a Hopper sort of vibe. Because I've always thought of Hopper as painting scenes of people alone together. And it strikes me that in Le Déjeuner, that all these figures are there occupying the same space, but no one's making eye contact with one another. And so it made me wonder, that's somebody I would have loved to have been able to give this challenge to. But of course, it was gone, 60 years ago. Can you think of other artists that you would have loved to have been able to extend this invitation to that, it was just after their time?
Oh, well, sure. Thinking of more historic artists, Picabia, Magritte, Dali. Picasso, of course, did many images based on this painting. It would have been great to ask Picasso to do a new one. But I think this work is a reference for almost every major figurative painter.
And in fact, very much a challenge that we encounter with the show, with prioritizing some of those precedents, and our decision was that to only include 6 of them. But then in the book, really, we had more room to include some of other great examples and great voices. So we added a compendium in the book, a separate chapter where we really had the luck of including some more artists whose work really added an important perspective to the conversation.
And it keeps coming. So when the book was already at the printer, we saw this recent painting of Henry Taylor. And on this theme, it's, oh, can we stop the presses and put in Henry Taylor? It was too late. But we can do volume 2.
I think the thing that's the most enjoyable about looking at this collection is that there are obvious similarities because you've given something for people to respond to, and there's a specific composition they're responding to. You know, some of the artists have chosen to upend gender roles, upend power structures, but some artists seem to have taken a totally creative response. For example, Sumaya Critchel's painting of a female figure in a lover's embrace with Mr. Peanut. I mean, it's a surprising image to see as part of the collection, right?
That's one of my favorite paintings from the show. And in fact, I bought it. I could only buy it with a promise that I would give it as a gift to a museum, which I'm going to do. But it's in my house now, so I can look at it every day. And very meaningful painting for me. So first, Sumaya understood that she's portraying a surrogate for Manet as a dandy. So Manet was a real 19th century French dandy. And as Mr. Peanut is pop art dandy. It's especially meaningful for me because when I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, there was a Planters peanut store downtown. And I was always asking my mother to take me downtown because there was a Mr. Peanut, a figure who wore a gigantic Mr. Peanut. It's not more than a mask. It was like a whole outfit that he was inside Mr. Peanut and walked around downtown Hartford to get people to go to the Planters Peanut store. And so that was a big part of my childhood, of going to see Mr. Peanut. That was amazing to see this conflation of Mr. Peanut and Manet as the dandy. And so you had a very important insight in Le Déjeuner sur l'air. The figures are alienated. They're not looking at each other. Okay? And I see this as a really important portrayal of the new sense of alienation of the modern urban situation. So very different than a family group that you might see in Dutch Golden Age painting. These are modern people. And just like our experience in an urban situation, we might be with dozens of people in a public situation, but we're not looking at each other. We're not really interacting. You can be on your own inside a group of people. That's part of the modern experience. And so that's one of the reasons why this painting is so meaningful and compelling. It has so many levels, but it's also a portrayal of consciousness in mid-19th century Paris, the beginning of the modern era.
Aruna D'Souza in the book, in her essay, offers different new readings of the painting, and one of them is that exactly of describing it as a painting of silence. I think it's a very poetic way of putting this.
It makes me think it's apropos that this challenge went out very close to the time of COVID. There's even a second Buzardin painting that kind of captures, a scene in the park, those scenes in the park that we were having during COVID where people had a 6-foot circle that they had to stay within with their peer group. Our whole society has gone through this period of sort of silent alienation, and I think we're still sort of responding to that, aren't we?
Yes, it's really changed social experience. But that's interesting to point out because, yes, these works were done in the context of the pandemic.
And several artists are addressing this specifically. Christina Quarles and Katja Saib, who paints an indoor quarantine version of the luncheon. So it's definitely on many of the artists' mind.
Well, Jeffrey, Viola, I can't thank you enough for taking time out to discuss this project. I encourage folks to pick up the book wherever you buy art books. It's from Rizzoli Electa. The title, Luncheons on the Grass, Reimagining Manet's Le Déjeuner célèbre. Jeffrey, Viola, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Craig.
Great.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.